a presentation probably, or Lenny did probably about 6 months ago.
Yeah.
But this is a new group, though, I think.
It's absolutely a new group.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Some of them may not be aware of like what we bring to the table, so I can take them through that a little bit, a few slides just to set the foundation, and then we can kind of open it up for discussion.
That's exactly the right approach.
All right. So I guess let me introduce myself first. So my name is Keith O'Brien. I'm the CTO for service provider at Palo Alto Networks. I've been at Palo Alto for about a year. So relatively new here, but I spent a good 2 decades prior to this at Cisco. And at Cisco, I was in the security business group for a good chunk of that, probably close to 15 years of doing security at Cisco. And alongside of that, I have some side things also all related to security. If there's interest, I'm involved at NYU as an adjunct professor in their cybersecurity program. I've built the cyber program over at, we have Lenny too, cool. Oh, cool. I built the cyber program over at the United States Coast Guard Academy. So, if there's any academic questions as well on how we're when I started this at the Coast Guard Academy, that was like 2005, 2006. It was still particularly in academia, it was still the knee-jerk reaction from the admirals in charge were like, why do we want to teach cadets how to hack things? That now we kind of laugh right now in 2022. Of course, that's exactly what we want them to do. But back then it was definitely a different discussion. And similarly, in the private sector, when we talk to, when you're building programs in NYU and some of the other places that I've worked, there was that hump to get over initially. But now I think, particularly in academia, we're well beyond that, doing research, pretty heavy research in security. We have a complete cybersecurity program stood up from a degree level, offering master's programs in cybersecurity. So all that does exist. And that's
one of the interesting things I've seen. One of the interesting things I think happening with, research and academia that's, I think, a really positive thing is I think you're seeing much tighter ties between, at the government level, certainly between academia, that's always been there, right? But there's much deeper ties between academia and commercial companies now on driving some of this research, right? I call it the public-private kind of models that are developing. And I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years, those things are really, really continuing to develop. And I think there's a lot of good coming out of those things. And so any perspective you have there, I think would be interesting as well.
I see some of my team. I'm going to introduce them as well. So Lenny is kind of he's our the godfather of 5G security over here at Palo Alto.
Thanks, Case. Thanks.
So if you have any technical questions on what we've done as far as the user plane security and 5G, and I have a few slides on that, Lenny. I'm just going to take them through because this is a new startup group. That hasn't really heard like what Palo Alto brings to the table. So a few slides on that. Mitch, who's an architect, works on my team. He's here. I see Hemi, who's also at Palo Alto, and Manu, right? So we have a good group from Palo Alto Networks is here as well. And all these folks are from the mobile team. So we all are involved in, to some degree, either service provider or mobile security focused.
Okay, good.
So, welcome. All right. Should we, let me share my screen here really quick. We'll go through a few slides just to set the stage, and then we can take questions, start a discussion, whatever makes the most sense.
Sounds good.
Hang on, wait. I think Teams wants permission from my Mac. Hang on, to share my screen. 1 second.
Your deck is up.
It is. Oh, good.
Yep.
Okay. See it? It just popped up. Perfect. All right. So I'm not going to go through all this because you said we want to have this more of an open discussion, but just to set the foundation and a lot of this that we're looking at 5G from a zero trust point of view, right? And you probably hear that term batted around quite a bit, both in government and enterprise. But we're looking at it from a few different angles where. And well, let me even back up on what zero trust is, because I'm a lot of people here probably aren't security folks. You may not have even heard of it. So Zero Trust really came about, I would say, the first time I've heard it was around 2012. And it came out of the NSA. And then we, following on that, we had some of the analysts kind of, further refined it. But around 2012, the director of the NSA at the time put forward an edict saying that we're going to design networks, our own internal networks within the NSA, to assume that we're already compromised, right? So, and at the time, that was a pretty big departure from how networks were traditionally defined and designed. Before that, it was, typical perimeter security, very hard defenses on the perimeter firewall type security. And then once you're past that, there's like no controls, right? So it's sometimes referred to as hard on the outside, soft on the inside kind of security. And the first, like I said, the first kind of deviation from that was the NSA when they came out and said that they're going to start designing their networks, assuming that the adversary is already on that network. And that's certainly a different type of an approach you have to take when you're thinking about Zero Trust. And then there were some other groups that came along around that time, a little bit later, maybe around 2014, 2015. We had the Jericho Forum that also pushed that model of removing the perimeter around an enterprise and having a perimeter-less security type approach. And then Google came along with their BeyondCorp model. They implemented what everyone was more or less talking about, and like how can you build an enterprise network without a clear perimeter? And it's still a great paper. It was published the first publication was around 2016, but if you've never read it, it's a great paper on how a technical paper on how they implemented Zero Trust within Google. But taking all those things aside, what Zero Trust really means is that we're going to do a few things. We're going to, aside from, traditional perimeter security, the shift is really to focus on the business outcomes, design from the inside out, determine what needs access, and inspect all logs and traffic. And the last two, the first two I think are pretty self-evident, but the last two are incredibly important, right? So one of the a traditional way that some networks and environments are built is that you authenticate the individual, and then after they're authenticated, there are no longer checks involved, right? Think of a VPN. You're VPNing into a network, you're authenticating, you're going to do your MFA, and then once you're in, you have complete lateral access to the environment. That's not Zero Trust, right? Because with that, you're inherently trusting the capability of the VPN environment. What Zero Trust really means is we're going to continuously evaluate, yes, we authenticated who you are, but is your state changing? Are you roaming now to a different area? Let's say you were previously in the office and now you've kind of roamed outside. Now you're sitting at Starbucks. So taking more, not only the who, but the context of where that person happens to be is incredibly important. And then continuously inspecting all of that traffic. So it's not just a static firewall rule where we're checking, is this individual allowed to go to port 80? Instead, we're continuously inspecting that traffic, understanding the applications, understanding the data that individual is allowed to access, and doing it on a continuous basis, not a point-in-time basis. And that is, I'm not going to say it's easy, but those kind of things are easier in an enterprise environment, right? So we have things in an enterprise like LDAP and as type of identity and authentication. In a mobile environment, it becomes a little, let me jump ahead here. It becomes a little more difficult in the fact that, well, in an enterprise environment, we can have, and this is how we really built up our business at Palo Alto, even from the early days. We changed the way firewalls work in the fact that we're doing that continuous inspection. We're not relying on just, hey, somebody is going to port 443, and so we're going to let them through. So it's beyond just doing layer 4 type inspection. Instead, we're continuously monitoring that traffic, identifying the application within those TCP connections, continuously scanning the content as it's going through the firewall, and then equally as important, identifying the user by using things like Active Directory and LDAP. So not just building a security rule based on an IP address, but building it on a user identity. And that years ago when we introduced that was a completely new approach in enterprise. Now, when we look at that model and we want to move it over to mobile networks, well, the application, okay, that doesn't really change in 4G and 5G networks, right? We can still identify the application, we can still identify the content, but how we identify a user is completely different. And so what we did is we looked at, well, how can we identify a user in a mobile network? Well, we have very clear ways to do it, right? We have a device identifier, the IMEI and the PEI, and subscriber identifiers, the IMSI and the SUPI. And much like we were previously using things like Active Directory and LDAP to resolve an IP address to a user identity, we took that same concept and adapted it to mobile networks. So now we can build policy based on device identifier and subscriber identifier. And further, as we go forward, we can also do things there. I mean, everybody here, I'm assuming, is up to speed on 5G, but everyone knows we have network slicing coming in on 5G. So we can also start building policies around network slices and detecting that network slice from the security appliance itself. And that's probably where, I mean, I have some other backup slides just to show you how we're combining it, but in the interest of just starting the discussion, that was really the innovation. Lenny did much of the work behind that and getting it going a number of years ago. But that's how we're looking at mobile security a little differently than others, in the fact that when I'm on calls with others, it's usually focused on, well, what is the security of the actual infrastructure of the mobile network, right? And that's incredibly important, obviously. Like, we want to make sure that the SBA is secure. We want to make sure that the RAN is secure. But what about the traffic, right? Like, that's all great. You can have a completely secure infrastructure, but if one of the endpoints gets compromised, yeah, it's all encrypted, but so what? You have encrypted malware now going across your network. So for a public kind of network that may or may not be of interest, we're seeing interest in providers selling that as a service, right? A tier one looking at, hey, if I can build policies in my network around a network slice ID, and I can start detecting command and control and malicious activity, I can sell that as a service to that subscriber of the slice. Also, within private 5G networks, it becomes probably even more important in that consumers of private 5G networks are used to regular enterprise types of visibility, right? So from running a Wi-Fi network or a regular campus Ethernet network, probably have controls and visibility in place where I can see the traffic flows. I have some sort of alerting on if endpoints are getting compromised, and I can now, resolve that back to a user, go call that user, hey, your laptop has malware, let's go remediate it. That kind of thing is not typically available today in mobile 5G networks, and that's what we're bringing to the table, right? To allow that visibility and control from the endpoint and looking at the traffic within those networks itself.
Keith, that's a really interesting point, and I'll jump in with a question there, right? Because you kind of went into an area that's really interesting to me. It's around this whole idea of, as 5G becomes an enabler for edge computing, right? The nature of the business as a CSP changes, right? It moves them into a different realm. And I'm not saying that there's not been applications that have run over 4G and LTE. We've had streaming apps, all those kinds of things where security, reliability, and scalability, all those critical things to a network and running it. But one of the things I think it's really interesting as we move into it, and you kind of hit on a little bit, is this idea of interoperability, right? With compute paradigms that are coming from the enterprise world and extending into the edge, right? And if we really want to see this idea idea of more and more data pushed to the edge for compute for lots of different reasons, whether it's latency in the application or quite honestly, data economics and those kinds of issues. You have to start to push out. And it's the marriage of what I think are wireless paradigms, right? Coming back into that edge and the enterprise network pushing out to the edge. And it's like, how does that interoperability happen? And it sounds like you guys are really addressing through your product portfolio. And I look at things like, what you guys call SASE or SaaS, right? Secure Access Service Edge, right?
Oh, SASE. Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Yep.
SASE, right? And it
Yep.
feels like that's an area where you guys are trying to package up a set of services that bridge those gaps that I think are starting to emerge, that I think are going to be critical to the edge. Is that something you guys are working on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like when you're thinking about compute workloads, data being pushed out to the edge, that's kind of the pinnacle of zero trust, right? Like how do you really manage your policy around a highly distributed environment beyond just people bringing their own devices to the workspace, right? But if you have your data distributed in a public cloud or even more distributed at the edge, how do you start managing the policy? How do you even define like where your data resides, right? Like that becomes critically important. Yes, and those are areas that we have a platform around. For the edge workloads and the edge workloads primarily, we have something called Prisma Cloud that addresses much of that, and that's more of looking at the policies around like which workloads can communicate to which other workloads. Are there issues around much of the MEC environments are based around containers, so are there things, vulnerabilities in those containers? Are the containers themselves secure, right? So are we, it's probably best practice to go ahead and take those containers, do some initial scanning of those containers for best practices before they're even deployed. So all of those kinds of things are hugely important. That's it's something we're also heavily invested in, to the point of also looking at how we can control and provide visibility for the 5G core itself, right? So we all know that 5G core is using REST APIs to communicate. Much of the technology we developed for just regular microservice applications in an enterprise environment running on a public cloud, we can now leverage in an SBA environment on a 5G network, and start doing things like building permit lists on an SBA to say, hey, if there's anything coming out of these microservices that are part of the core that isn't defined in the 3GPP specs, then maybe we should deny that, right? So we know what they should be saying, right? And if they're saying something different, if the communication between the microservices is not defined in the Swagger definition, then maybe that's something that we should deny or at least alert on, right? And those are things that we have. All of that technology exists today. I think we're still a little early on getting just the 5G cores up and running, but I think that's going to be an issue pretty quickly. Good.
Charles, question? Jump in.
Yeah, hi. Keith, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very useful and educational. Just curious about when you're in a mixed environment with different vendors and such like, is it a challenge for your application to work amongst all the different vendors and provide that security that you are aiming to provide?
No, I mean, maybe Lenny will probably jump in here a little bit, but the way we do it is we sit on the N3 and N4 interfaces. So as long as we can pull off the user ID and device ID off the N4 interface, we can correlate that back to the user plane on the N3. So we're looking at standard 3GPP interfaces, and the partners that we're working with, and we are working with a number of partners who are also part of the oil lab here. That's an approach we're taking. We're also looking at alternate approaches, right? Like, are there better ways to get that information as well? But yeah, we can interoperate because we're sitting on standard interfaces to get that information.
Great. So yeah, Kurt, if you could do an introduction, that'd be great, because I think there's another way to do it.
Okay.
Good,
so Charles, who are you with? I didn't get you.
Shibodi, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and Charles, that's interesting, right? Because that's part of why this ecosystem exists and why Palo Alto's, right? They want to continue to learn from you all as well, and there's different ideas and different perspectives on how to go address problems. And I think that's why Palo Alto is part of the ecosystem is to hear new ideas, right? And so I won't put that in, but I'll make that connection. Or Stephen, if you could take that and make a connection, that'd be great. Keith, I'll jump back in with another question real quickly. Look at this idea you talked about, distributed computing, right? And everything's starting to change and those kind of things, whether it's, devices and edge and cloud native and everything's changing. You made a comment at a conference, I think, a little bit about visibility, right? You can't protect what you can't see, right? Can you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing with your platform and your products on the visibility side of things?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, the first one that we just spoke about, our mobile security, we have a platform. It's called Strata. That's basically our, think of that as our next generation firewall that we've added mobility features to. So precisely what I was saying before, the visibility that we're providing is being able to dip into those GTP tunnels and pull out the information and identify things like malware and C2 callbacks, right? So without that kind of technology, you wouldn't have that visibility in a mobile network. And most of the private 5G implementations we've seen so far, yes, they'll show you things like which endpoints and which SIM cards are registered to the network. But when you ask for, okay, can I see the traffic flow from that particular endpoint and where it's going out on the internet, that doesn't exist. And that's the visibility that we're specifically applying to, let's say, like a private 5G network or even a public network could be offering this kind of thing as a slice. So in a mobile environment, that's without a doubt, that's one of the big things we've invested in. But then other things that I mentioned before, providing that visibility on the core, around how the microservices are communicating, and then also just compute environments on the edge and providing that same kind of thing with how, not only how are they communicating, but what are those workloads doing on the host in that MEC environment, right? Are they mounting volumes that they shouldn't be mounting? Are they assuming root when they shouldn't be assuming root? All those kinds of details that are important to monitor on an ongoing basis as workloads and containers are being spun up on a MEC environment. Those are the kinds of things that we're watching on a continuous basis within those MEC environments.
Cool, thanks, that's helpful. Raj, you want to jump in with your question? Introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, I'm Raj Nair. I'm with Avesha. We actually have some ways where we might be able to work with you on something. Let me explain to you what we do. We are actually working at the application level, and we have this notion of application slices. But the idea is to give you these guardrails, but at the application level, and it works across multiple clusters and so on.
Right, your company was again? I missed it.
Avesha, Avesha.
Okay.
So Avesha. So what I was thinking is, while you're providing the security at the network layer, and it would be interesting to see if there was a way to connect up so that you would know exactly, because what we do is we're working in the application space where the application deployment teams and so on, they're enforcing, or they're at least specifying what should be the resource controls, the access controls and so on for the users. But then it would be great if that was actually somehow.
So you're doing that within the app. So you're providing identity within the application. Am I hearing that right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. I think I know the space you're working in. All right.
But then it would be great to make it seamless, and
okay.
Connect that with what you guys are doing.
Oh, so the application can get identity maybe from what we're seeing. Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, that could be interesting.
That would be interesting. So yeah, I would love to connect up with you maybe later to continue that conversation.
Good. Anybody else have any questions? I'm just trying to get you to prompt in with some questions.
Actually, Kurt, I got a Vikram over here. I got a question.
Yeah, jump in, Vic.
So, question for you is like Palo, like Juniper's big in the 5G security play. How does Palo Alto differentiate its offering from what some of the other competitors are doing in this space? Because right now I'm almost seeing like 5G is becoming a bit of a buzzword in a crowded space where everyone's got their own flavor of the same thing, or they claim to be. So I'm just curious, like, how does Palo Alto differentiate what it's doing, and why does Palo Alto feel what they're doing is so much more game changing than any of the others are doing?
Hey, so I think that, hey, Lenny, are you there? Because that's probably a perfect one for you. Because so Lenny used to work for Juniper, and then he came over here. So he was kind of, he's probably there's Lenny, you want to take that one? He was asking like, how are we like, how are we doing better than Juniper?
I will not, of course, I will not address any competitive information. So it's a wrong question. If you would like to discuss what we can do, I can definitely discuss. I will not address any competitive discussion.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, so
we're doing something.
It was more me just understanding. I just use Juniper as an example in terms of, because like the 5G security domain is becoming big, especially with Microsoft and their acquisitions. It was more to understand like, how does Palo Alto, not necessarily one specific vendor per se, but just broadly speaking, how do you differentiate your offering, and what is you doing that's so much unique than what, broadly speaking, some of your competitors in this space are not doing?
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead, Lenny. Lenny.
Vikram, once again, please don't combine the same question competitive, because I will not answer any question. So please ask specific question, what you are doing differently, and happy to answer this. Where is your uniqueness?
I mean,
very
basically,
simple.
Yeah, go ahead.
And it's very simple. I can answer this part of the question, but not combine it with any competitive. So this is what Keith presented. Today, in 4G or 3G, you have basic, I would say, dumb pipe security. It's basic layer 3, layer 4 denial of service NAT. It's irrelevant in 5G, because 5G is for enterprises to do digital transformation. If we agree on that point, what we had in 3G and 4G is needed, but irrelevant from the business perspective. You need enterprise grade security. In order, and what is enterprise grade security? This is what Keith was presenting you. For example, identify on the level of user ID, your SIM card identity, IMSI, on the level of your equipment identity, IMEI. In today, it's mainly still 4G, but definitely moving into 5G. Do security policies based on these identifiers. This is our uniqueness. You can build security policies based on your SIM card identity or groups or ranges, and do it differently for another group or ranges of your SIM cards or your equipment identities, imaging your cellular IoT devices and groups of your cellular IoT devices. Or another topic that Keith mentioned is per slice. Slice is a major, by far, fundamental difference between 4G and 5G. You cannot do end-to-end in 3G and 4G. You cannot assure bandwidth or quality of service. What is missing there, if the whole purpose of 5G is to give enterprises digital transformation? Security is missing. Enterprise-grade security is missing. And this is what we are adding. We can dynamically, in the real time, give different security policies per different slices, exactly as 5G can give it dynamically end-to-end quality of service and bandwidth. We can add security here. Everything that I added right now, it's unique differentiation, unique capabilities of our technology. So I hope I answer your question.
You did. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Lenny, I think that's a good response to the question, and something I would layer in based upon what I heard Keith say that I think is unique based upon what I've heard other security people talk about is your ongoing monitoring of the behavior of that identity, right? And so, look, you can sometimes fool identity and access. It's happened, right? But your ability and what you talked about in terms of monitoring ongoing behavior of that identity as it moves into an application, into some data realm, I think is really, really interesting in terms of your approach there. And because what you can do is identify, quite honestly, behavioral aspects up against that identity to make sure that they're actually set against whether it's the right policy of access, the behavior of that particular application. I think that to me is what I heard and what Keith was presenting is another differentiating factor. Tell me if I'm wrong.
So no, 100%. So imagine that something is changing about that endpoint. Like I said, it could be where that endpoint is physically located. You're going out of a secured environment you're building, your company's building, to a Starbucks, or you could be going to an untrusted country. Maybe you landed in a country that is designated as untrusted by your company, you would want to maybe shift where to a different slice, right? Maybe you want to go onto a more secure slice with more monitoring based on where that endpoint and the state of that endpoint is. But all of that requires, as you said, that continuous monitoring of the endpoint. It's not just, hey, this endpoint is authenticated, it's in, and we're going to let it go from there. So it's really about the continuous verification of the state of the endpoint and the traffic that is being transmitted by that endpoint, and then adapting, right? Adapting policies. Another thing that, outside of what we're talking about here, but when you start looking at the identity problem, you also maybe want to start pushing additional factors to an endpoint, right? Like if I'm in an untrusted country, when I'm in the United States, maybe just hitting the accept on my push from Okta or Duo is acceptable. But if I'm in China, maybe my laptop, I want to put in a physical hard token with a biometric, right? And that's all based on where the endpoint is located, what the endpoint is doing, and beyond just like this endpoint, this SIM card is trusted and we're going to let it in, right?
Yeah, so you move beyond policy, right? And what I think the world is evolving to is a world of AI and ML to do predictive analytics around security, right? And I think that's where you're leading to. And I think that's an exciting place, because I think that's the kind of security that is going to be required, right, for the edge to really develop, for people to start moving mission critical data and applications further into distributed environments, right? Because those things exist in a closed network environment, right? As those things get distributed, by nature, they open up a little bit more. And so security models are going to have to change for the edge to happen. I think it's fundamental.
Yep, 100%. And
Cool.
we are, one of the things we didn't mention so far, but we are working very closely with all the cloud providers, right? So getting all this technology, working on AWS and Azure and GCP and all of their edge environments is critical.
Yep.
Mostly that is, we're also seeing a lot of interest. You mentioned SASE.
Yep.
This is kind of early days with mobile and SASE. I mean, SASE is doing well on itself, but we are also looking at, hey, well, how can we, if you're maybe have a private 5G environment, do you really need a firewall on-prem, or can you take the N6 coming out of that private 5G environment and just send it to a SASE, type of service for the security inspection? Those are all things that we're exploring and are certainly possible. Just a matter of architecting the network appropriately.
Gotcha. So I'll change back a little bit. You guys have mentioned slicing as well as private networking, those kind of things. In the market right now, where do you see the real momentum, right? Are people moving to more on the 5G spectrums, right? Are they moving more towards, private networks? Are you seeing CSPs really move forward with slicing services and capabilities? Where do you see kind of the balance in the market right now?
Yeah, I'll give you mine. Lenny can give you his too. Slicing is early days, but it's happening, right? And I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody here, but we're starting to work with some partners in that space. But certainly, private networks are, and even like some of the things you're working on with the Port of Tacoma, right? I mean, that's a perfect example. And when we start looking at those private networks, as Lenny said, it's bringing enterprise-grade security to these private mobile networks, right? And it's going to be very difficult for an entity like the Port of Tacoma to fully adopt a private 5G network for the port if they don't have the same visibility and control that they're used to in their existing enterprise network, right? So if their security folk, whoever that happens to be, comes in and says, "Well, wait a minute, I can't. How do I see the state of the laptops or mobile devices on the network? I can't see if any of them are infected. I can't see if any of them are doing command and control callbacks to malware servers." I mean, all those things are important, and you can probably do some of that, right, on the edge, but then you lose who generated it, right? If it's all going through a NAT device, then all right, yeah, I know I have an infected device somewhere at the port out of maybe 1,000 devices. Which one is it? So it's incredibly important to take that, not only detect it, but be able to map it back to using some of the things we just spoke about, back to the device and user sitting on that mobile network.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good example, and I think I don't know if Keith has Jim talked to you about what we're doing potentially with Vornado in New York as well.
He mentioned it casually, but not in detail.
Yeah, so Vornado's a massive real estate trust in New York. They own Madison Square Garden and a bunch of buildings in central New York, but they also own a bunch of real estate up and down the East Coast. And they have a vision of, quite honestly, providing retail services, right? Retail as a service, which would encompass, quite honestly, operational capabilities in a lot of those environments, right? And so they are going to have to be thinking about that, as well. If they want to provide, access and services and compute as far as edge services as part of what they think about the future of retail operations, they're going to have to think about those same kind of things as well.
So they're packaging kind of edge services with real estate. Interesting. Okay.
They certainly really around the real estate that they own and
no,
rent
makes
out,
sense.
right?
Makes
that's
sense.
The vision that
I
they
used to work in one of their buildings, so it makes complete sense. Yeah.
So
put
that's
a
the vision they want to explore, right? So we're thinking about setting up a lab with them in New York. We're in final negotiation.
Oh, wow. That would be very interested in doing it. I mean, that's my back. I live in New York, right outside of it, so that'd be perfect.
Yeah, so it's similar to what we're doing down in there. It's another one that's emerging, but I think it's another one because I think some of the data and applications that are run through there will have a different nature. And I think you enter these B2B to C types of services, as well as B2B that you're going to see down in the port. I think it's a whole nother set of, I'll say, security paradigms that have to be addressed, right? In terms of data management.
Again, yeah, it comes back to, I mean, all of those, the folks in Vornado, they're enterprise companies, right? So if you're building a mobile network and you can't report back to them what's running on the network, and it's not only malware, right? I mean, they're going to want just metrics on just how the network is performing, right? Just and having that visibility on, if you have your CEO in the company on that mobile network and they're complaining that their Zoom is dropping out, right? Like, and you don't have that visibility into those endpoints and what they're communicating to, that becomes a little bit problematic.
Yeah,
and we've invested a lot of money in like that application performance monitoring. We made some acquisitions in the past, and it's all about that, right? When you have that user calling up, where in the network, in the entire network is the problem lie, right? Is it on the local link, or is it the application? Is it somewhere in between? And those are difficult problems, but it all comes back to enterprise grade security within that private network.
Yep, absolutely. So I'll prompt the group again. Any questions from the group? You guys can't let me just dominate all the questions here.
No, yeah.
Raj, jump in.
Yes. Hey, thanks. But one question I had for you, Keith, is when you operate in different domains, like in these networks in Europe and so on, and even other places, there's some level of with which you have to be careful about where the data goes, to meet with GDPR requirements and so on.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing these monitoring, like you're doing, I mean, is it all localized processing? Do you take that into account when you do your?
Yeah. So so if we're talking about the slides that I showed you, those few slides on how we can look into the user plane, that's all. The way we implement that is with our NGFW VM series, or it could be a containerized firewall as well. So it's really if you're building your own private network, let's make it simple. Like, say you have a private network somewhere in Germany and you want to have that visibility on the user plane, you would instrument our VM into the user plane on the N3 and the N4 on that local environment. And so the data is not leaving. It doesn't have to leave that local environment, right? So we're not reporting. I didn't really get into the details, but we have a separate management construct called Panorama. And that management that's collecting all of that information can reside anywhere you like. It can be co-located in that same site itself, or you can, spin it up in AWS and define it in a certain region. So all of that is flexible. It's really up to you and how you would want to deploy it.
Okay, thanks.
Good. So, Keith, one question that I have is obviously, Palo Alto had its own journey as a startup, right? And gone through that. Any perspective of, growing into a major enterprise provider now, right? In terms of what that journey is for a startup and what you have to go. I always talk about it in terms of, there's these fundamental things to be a player in the enterprise that you have to go do. And I call them the ITIs, right? Security, reliability, interoperability, manageability, all those things that are so inherent in any enterprise application or any enterprise enterprise infrastructure, right? That are just must-haves or fundamental. And it's one of the things that as a startup, you try to go solve a very specific problem, but if you're not thinking about how you both leverage and integrate from an interoperability perspective, you're going to get lost, right? You're not going to be part of the consideration set. And so any perspective on what you guys had to do at Palo Alto to address that kind of issue to become an enterprise player?
Well, I mean, to be clear, I wasn't around in the early days of Palo Alto, but I do have some perspective on that. And that in my days at Cisco, I did a lot of the technical analysis on the acquisitions we did. And I think everyone knows Cisco is kind of like the Borg with that, as far as acquiring companies. So I have, I have a insight into that. Most of the time, when we looked at startups in that vein, it was security was a big problem, right? Because even if it was an enterprise type of model that they were going after, there was very little controls being put in place, even around software development, right? And those were the things that we really had to spend. If we decided, okay, we're going to go and bring this company into the fold, there was a good year or two of just straightening out, like, forget GDPR, but just basic good software hygiene practices that we would have to adhere to. So not that, look, I mean, I know as a startup that kind of goes down to the bottom of the heap, but as you start selling into larger enterprises, they start looking at that from an RFP level, as far as like how what your software development looks like, and also another thing is like how do you respond to security incidents within your product is hugely important, right? Like, what is do you even have a process to do that? And then how you respond to the market, right? You probably look at a lot of companies out there that have done it well and have done it poorly. And in my opinion, the companies that do it well are the ones that are very transparent about the security problem that occurred. And the ones that do it poorly are the ones that wait a long time, whether through, because they have to or not. They wait a long time to make the announcement. When they make the announcement, they're very vague on, what exactly transpired. But I think, in this day and age and looking at all of the things that have occurred, I think you can confidently say that the more information you provide when your company has a security incident, the better. And everybody will, right? I mean, that including startups, you're probably more vulnerable because you don't have huge teams of security folks, watching after you. But if and when that occurs, you have a vulnerability in your code or something happens. I think I can tell you the security industry itself will be like sharks to blood water if you're not transparent, right? And you see that. I've seen that over and over again.
Keith, I think you hit on that up front when you talked about your approach to zero trust a little bit, Trina. It's not saying everyone has to get to zero trust, right? But you talked about, let's assume that there is. How are we going to respond to it, right? What are we going to go do, right? Because knowing that, hey, if it does happen, right, and things continue to evolve, and it always will happen, how are you going to respond to, number one, fixing it? How are you going to respond to supporting the customer that you have in that? What are the SLAs that you need to be meet, or what are you committing to? And so
I think at this point, everybody knows. I mean, look at 10 years ago, if you had a vulnerability in your code, I'm not going to say people don't freak out now, but I think everybody is in the industry now mature enough to understand that, software is not perfect. There always will be vulnerabilities. I don't think there's a company in the industry that hasn't had that problem, but the companies that have problems are the ones that aren't transparent, try and hide it, or are not providing full information on what's transpired, right? So that's certainly, and particularly if you're a startup working with larger enterprise companies, and I've dealt with large enterprise companies in my previous life, and dealing with large SPs here at Palo Alto, that doesn't play with them, right? So they know what type of information is expected when a vulnerability occurs, and if you're either providing that in a delayed fashion or a non-transparent fashion, that really reflects poorly on you as a startup. So that would be, I mean, if I were doing a startup today, and if and when that vulnerability occurs, that would be from a security point of view, that's the advice I would give.
I think that's good advice. And I think learning to work with folks like yourself who are the heart of some of those security deployments inside of an enterprise or a 5G environment is really, really important, right? Don't ever assume that it's not your issue. It's like, no, hey, let's work with, Keith and his team to figure out what the issue is in that customer environment, because we are part of the, I'll say, heterogeneous compute environment that are part of that 5G solution, right? And so you got to be willing as a startup to work with others in the industry. And that's the interoperability piece that I think is really, really important as well. Not only on the working of the software, but ultimately, how do you respond to working with a customer?
100%. 100%.
Good. Well, I'm all out of questions, Keith. And so if there's any parting messages you'd like to leave, I don't think there's any other messages.
Well, the
from
one
group.
thing that you kind of threw out there, maybe if there are others that would be interested on this call, but the real estate investment trust angle is interesting. I never really, Jim mentioned it in passing. I never really gave it a lot of thought, but now that you threw it out there, it makes a ton of sense to me. I never really thought of,
So
yeah,
Keith,
of course,
I have
real
an action
estate
item that
and
we're going to follow up with
is-
you. We're
is
going to
awesome.
follow up
Yeah.
with you and get a briefing on that project all up.
Great.
One of the things that we will do is similar to what we did in the thing is once we kind of finalize the contract, which we're hoping to get here in the next couple of weeks, is we want to go deep into a use case analysis and study with them and really get into depth in terms of what they want to try to accomplish, right? Because we're not only going to go build a network around that, we're going to build an entire program around it and start looking at very specific use cases that they want to go address. And I think so. We'll get you a briefing on the project on the side and do that. And we owe you that as a follow-up.
Oh, yeah. While everyone's here, so we're planning, I guess there's going to be a tour at the port next month. So I think I'm planning on flying out. If anybody else is going to be there, I'd be glad to meet anybody in person at that tour.
Awesome. That's another reason for our startups to get signed up to meet and have conversations with you. So that's a great opportunity.
Cool. Great.
Cool. All right. Well, with that, I think I'll give you some time back, Keith, Lenny, and team from Palo Alto. Thank you very much for making the time. I learned a couple of things on these calls. It's fantastic. I've been in the industry for 35 years. I've never been a security expert, but I understand the importance of security in enterprise compute. And I think it's really valuable as we think about the edge and the different types of markets that are going to develop around the so-called edge. I think there's 5G, there's private networks, there's network capabilities. I really think that security is fundamental. And I don't think without the right security models and right approaches, none of this is going to happen. Right? Distributed computing will not happen without the right security, right? So I think it is so fundamental because people aren't going to start trusting a lot of this stuff if they don't see the right security models being deployed at the edge or available for them to deploy with their own environments in a private network. And so I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. I think it's critical. And as we think about, this nascent edge market developing, without folks like yourself pushing the envelope on this and developing the right solutions, none of it's going to happen. So appreciate all the work you guys are doing.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to meeting everyone in person.
Sounds good. We'll talk to you soon, Keith. And Jim and I will follow up on that.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Cheers.